Welcome to Sherlock's Casebook, where every mystery has a story, and every story hides a secret. Step into the world of deduction, suspense, and untold cases of Sherlock Holmes. Are you ready to uncover the truth? The Phantom in the Fog. It was on one of those dreary London evenings when the gas lamps did little to dispel the creeping fog that wrapped itself around Baker Street, like a silent predator. I had just returned from a particularly taxing house call when I found Sherlock Holmes standing by the window of our sitting room at 221B, his keen eyes fixed upon the murky streets below. "You are later than expected, Watson," he remarked without turning, his tone neither questioning nor reproachful, merely stating a fact. I sighed, removing my gloves and setting aside my medical bag. "You astound me, Holmes. I don't recall mentioning my exact hour of return." Holmes gave a half-smile as he tapped his fingers against the wooden frame. "The fresh mud on the soles of your boots suggests you have been walking along the southern end of Marylebone, where the roadworks have turned the pavement into a veritable quagmire. Given the time, I deduce you were waylaid by an urgent case. An elderly patient, no doubt, as you bear the faint scent of liniment." I shook my head in admiration, but before I could respond, our landlady, Mrs. Hudson, rapped sharply on the door and entered with a concerned expression. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes. He's in a dreadful state, I must say." Holmes turned, his interest piqued. "Show him in, if you please." A moment later, a thin, nervous gentleman of middle age stepped into our quarters. His clothes were of fine quality but dishevelled, his hair unkempt, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. His eyes darted about the room before settling upon Holmes with an expression of barely concealed desperation. "You must help me, Mr. Holmes," he burst out, his voice carrying a distinct quaver. "Something unnatural is haunting the reading room of the Belgrave Library. A spectre, a ghastly apparition." I could not help but glance at Holmes, expecting him to wave away such a claim with his usual disdain for the supernatural. Instead, he steepled his fingers and leaned forward with an air of curiosity. "Start from the beginning, sir," he said, "and do be precise." A most unsettling account. The nervous gentleman settled into the chair Holmes indicated, though he perched on its edge as if prepared to bolt at any moment. He clutched his hat in both hands, wringing the fabric as he struggled to collect himself. "Compose yourself, sir," Holmes said with measured patience. "Begin with your name and profession." The man exhaled sharply. "My name is Arthur Lomax. I am the senior librarian at the Belgrave Library, an institution of considerable repute." He hesitated before adding, "or at least it was until these events began." Holmes motioned for him to continue. Lomax leaned forward, lowering his voice as though fearing the spectre itself might be lurking in the shadows. "For nearly 2 weeks now, something unnatural has plagued our library. Late at night, when the halls should be silent, the staff and I have heard inexplicable noises, soft shuffling footsteps where none should be, the rustling of pages in an empty room, whispers that vanish when one turns to listen properly." "Curious," Holmes murmured, "but not necessarily spectral." Lomax nodded hesitantly. "That was my initial thought as well. I attributed it to drafts, echoes, perhaps even an overactive imagination. But then we saw it." His hands tightened around his hat, figure, pale, indistinct, yet undeniably human in shape. It drifts between the shelves, vanishing before one can approach. Holmes's expression remained impassive, though I saw the slight narrowing of his eyes, a sign that his mind was already at work. "Have you attempted to apprehend this apparition?" Lomax shuddered. "One of our junior clerks, Mr. Edward Grayson, tried just 2 nights past. He swore he saw the figure standing by the restricted archives. He rushed forward, calling out, but the instant he reached the spot, it had vanished. No doors opened, no windows were ajar. There was simply nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine, but Holmes only nodded, as though filing the information away for later use." "And this has occurred within the library alone? No disturbances elsewhere?" Lomax hesitated. He swallowed. "No, at least none that I have heard of." Holmes tapped his fingers together. "And what of the restricted archives? What do they contain?" Lomax shifted uncomfortably. "A collection of rare manuscripts, some of which date back centuries. Fragile, valuable, and in some cases dangerous." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Dangerous? In what sense?" Lomax hesitated again, his reluctance evident. "There are certain volumes, historical records, obscure treatises, whose contents have long been considered sensitive. Some deal with matters that have caused controversy in their time." Holmes leaned back, considering. "A phantom haunting a library," he mused. "One that appears near valuable and sensitive documents, yet leaves no trace of intrusion. Tell me, Mr. Lomax, has anything gone missing?" Lomax's breath hitched. "Not that I am aware of." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I believe an evening visit to Belgrave Library is in order." I blinked. "You mean to investigate tonight?" "Of course," he said, rising to his feet. "A spectre that vanishes when approached is nothing more than a puzzle in need of solving." He glanced at Lomax. "I assume you would not object to our presence?" Lomax exhaled in visible relief. "Not at all, Mr. Holmes. In fact, I implore you, come and see for yourself." Holmes reached for his coat. "Excellent. Then, Watson, prepare yourself. We are about to chase a ghost." Into the halls of shadow. The evening air was thick with fog as Holmes and I stepped from our cab onto the cobbled streets of Belgrave Square. A lone gas lamp flickered by the entrance of the grand yet solemn facade of the Belgrave Library. The towering structure, with its stone columns and vast arched windows, loomed over us like a silent sentinel. Mr. Lomax, who had accompanied us, fumbled with his keys as he ushered us through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the library was a cathedral of knowledge. Long rows of towering bookshelves stretched into the dimly lit recesses of the building, their spines glistening in the subdued glow of gas lamps. A faint mustiness clung to the air, mingled with the scent of old parchment and ink. The vast reading hall was empty, its polished floors reflecting the low light. Holmes removed his gloves and cast a sweeping glance about the room. "A most suitable setting for a haunting," he murmured, his tone neither dismissive nor indulgent. Mr. Lomax cleared his throat. "It is beyond unsettling, Mr. Holmes. The disturbances occur primarily after midnight, though even now, I feel—" He shuddered, leaving the thought unfinished. Holmes strode forward, his sharp eyes darting across the shelves, the desks, the very floor beneath our feet. "Watson, what do you observe?" he asked suddenly. I looked around, trying to match Holmes's keen scrutiny. A well-kept library, though the air is damp. The gaslights cast long shadows, which may contribute to an illusion of movement. Holmes nodded. An astute, if conventional, assessment. He turned back to Lomax. You mentioned that the manifestation was last seen near the restricted archives. Yes, Lomax replied, leading us toward a set of imposing iron-barred doors at the far end of the hall. He produced another key and turned it in the lock with an audible click. The doors groaned open, revealing a smaller chamber lined with glass cases and locked cabinets. A single desk sat in the centre, its surface littered with scattered papers. Holmes moved forward, his fingers gliding over the wooden surface. Was this desk disturbed when you last entered? Lomax frowned. No, at least I do not recall it being in disarray. Holmes lifted a loose page, scanning its contents. A catalogue of the library's rare collections, he noted. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he produced his magnifying glass and bent lower. Watson, the lamp. I held my walking stick in one hand and adjusted the wick of the nearby gas lamp, casting a brighter glow upon the desk. Holmes studied the surface intently, his sharp gaze tracing over an area near the desk's edge. He exhaled softly. Fascinating. I stepped closer. What have you found? Holmes straightened, slipping his magnifying glass back into his coat. A fingerprint, barely visible but distinct. He turned to Lomax. Do you or any of your staff work without gloves while handling these archives? Lomax shook his head vehemently. Never. It is strictly against regulations. Holmes clasped his hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. Then we are not dealing with a spectre, Mr. Lomax, but with someone very much alive. At that moment a sudden noise echoed through the library, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable rustling of paper. Lomax stiffened. Did you hear that? He whispered. Holmes held up a hand for silence. A few tense moments passed. Then, without warning, he strode towards the open chamber doors. Stay close, he murmured. We followed him out into the vast reading hall where the gaslights flickered, casting elongated shadows. The library was as still as before, yet an undeniable presence lingered. Holmes's gaze swept the space with razor-sharp focus. Then, above us, on the upper mezzanine, a faint movement caught my eye. A pale figure, half concealed in the gloom, drifted between the shelves. Lomax let out a sharp breath. It's there. Holmes tilted his head slightly. Indeed, but the question is, who is watching whom? And with that, he took off toward the staircase, his coat billowing behind him. The vanishing figure Holmes ascended the staircase with astonishing speed, his footfalls eerily silent upon the carpeted steps. I followed as best I could, my pulse quickening. Mr. Lomax trailed behind, his breath ragged with anxiety. Above us, the spectral figure drifted further into the shadows, its pale form wavering in the dim light. Holmes reached the mezzanine landing and strode purposefully between the towering shelves. I struggled to keep up, my eyes darting left and right, expecting at any moment for the apparition to dissolve into thin air. A rustling noise sounded just ahead, a fleeting whisper of movement. Holmes lunged forward, rounding a corner. I arrived mere seconds later, only to find him standing motionless before an empty stretch of bookshelves. The air was still. The figure vanished. Gone, I muttered, scanning the shelves. How is that possible? Holmes's sharp eyes traced the floor, his hands gliding along the wooden frame of the bookcases. He crouched briefly, studying something at the base of the shelving unit, then rose with a quiet hum. "Oh, curious," he murmured. "Tell me, Watson, what do you see?" I peered at the space he had examined, but nothing seemed amiss. "Only books and dust," I admitted. Holmes gave a faint smile. "And yet the dust here is disturbed in a most deliberate manner." He gestured toward faint impressions upon the floor. "Whoever our visitor was, they are not supernatural, merely adept at vanishing from sight." Lomax arrived, his face flushed with exertion. "You saw it, didn't you?" he gasped. "The figure, right here. And now it's simply gone?" Holmes turned, fixing him with an unreadable expression. "Tell me, Mr. Lomax, who else had access to the library this evening?" Lomax hesitated. "Only myself, the night porter, and—" he faltered. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Lomax shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Edward Grayson, the junior clerk I mentioned earlier. He was here late, completing inventory. I left him in the lower archives before coming to fetch you." Holmes' expression darkened with intrigue. "And does young Mr. Grayson believe in ghosts?" Lomax frowned. I cannot say, but he was certainly shaken after his last encounter with the apparition." Holmes tapped his fingers against the bookshelf. "Then I believe it is high time we spoke with him. The lower archives were housed in a chamber beneath the main reading hall, accessible by a narrow stone staircase. As we descended, the air grew colder, the silence heavy with an almost oppressive weight. Holmes pushed open the door, and our lamps cast long, flickering shadows across the subterranean room. Rows of shelves lined the space, housing countless volumes of historical significance. In the far corner, hunched over a desk, sat a young man with auburn hair and spectacles perched upon his nose. He startled at our entrance, nearly upsetting an inkwell. "Mr. Grayson?" Lomax called. "Are you still at work?" The young man blinked, adjusting his glasses. "Sir, yes, I was finishing the inventory." His voice carried a note of nervousness, his hands fidgeting with the ledger before him. Holmes stepped forward, studying him intently. "You were in the library earlier this evening, were you not?" Grayson hesitated. "Yes, I was." "And did you see anything unusual?" The young man paled slightly. "No, nothing." His fingers drummed against the desk. Holmes's gaze remained fixed upon him. "Curious. You seem unsettled, Mr. Grayson. Almost as though you expected to see something." Grayson swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward Lomax. I don't know what you mean." Holmes smiled faintly. "No? Then you will not mind if we examine the ledger you were writing in." Grayson's grip tightened around the book, but after a moment's hesitation, he pushed it forward. Holmes flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning the entries. Then, quite suddenly, he paused. "Ah!" I stepped closer. "What is it?" Holmes turned the ledger toward us, tapping a particular entry with his finger. "Mr. Watson, note the date and time of this inventory entry." I read aloud, "Restricted archive, catalogue check, completed at 9:15 p.m. "And what of it?" I asked. Holmes closed the book with a soft snap. "An excellent detail, save for one minor inconsistency. His eyes locked onto Grayson's. When Mr. Lomax left to retrieve us, the restricted archives were locked. A tense silence followed. Grayson's breath hitched. Holmes studied him for another moment before stepping back. "You may relax, Mr. Grayson. I have no doubt that you saw something in the library this evening, though I suspect the true nature of your fear lies not in what you witnessed, but in what you know." Grayson's lips parted, but no words came. Lomax frowned, shifting uncomfortably. "Holmes, what are you suggesting?" Holmes turned, heading toward the exit. "That our so-called ghost is no phantom at all, and that our real mystery is just beginning." With that, he strode up the staircase, leaving us in uneasy silence. The secret clue. Holmes led the way back up the narrow staircase, his movements brisk and determined. I followed close behind, my mind racing with the implications of what we had just witnessed. The so-called Specter had been real enough. Flesh and blood rather than an apparition, and yet it had vanished with unnatural ease. And then there was young Mr. Grayson, whose hesitations and contradictions had not gone unnoticed by my companion. As we emerged once more into the vast reading hall, Mr. Lomax turned to Holmes with an anxious expression. "You do not truly believe Edward Grayson to be involved, do you?" Holmes adjusted his cuffs absent-mindedly. "Involvement is a matter of degree, Mr. Lomax. Guilt, however, is quite another matter." Lomax sighed. "He is a bright lad. I should hate to think—" Holmes waved a hand. "Fear not. I do not believe our junior clerk is the mastermind behind these disturbances." He glanced toward the mezzanine where the figure had disappeared. "No, there is another hand at play here." I cleared my throat. "Holmes, you mentioned that Grayson's inventory record held an inconsistency. Do you believe he falsified it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "It is not the act of falsification that intrigues me, Watson, but rather his reason for doing so. Grayson is hiding something, though whether out of fear or complicity remains to be seen." At that moment, a distant clang echoed through the library, a metallic sound muffled by the thick walls. Holmes's head snapped toward the noise. That came from the restricted archives. Without another word, he strode swiftly across the reading hall, his long coat sweeping behind him. Lomax and I hurried after him, our footsteps muffled against the carpeted floor. Upon reaching the iron-barred door to the restricted archives, Holmes paused, his keen eyes examining the lock. It was still fastened securely. "Curious," he murmured. He then reached into his pocket, producing a small magnifying lens. Leaning in close, he examined the keyhole. After a few moments, he straightened. "Watson, kindly pass me your pocket-knife." I complied without hesitation. With practised ease, Holmes ran the flat edge of the blade along the frame of the door. A moment later, he held it up for us to see. In the dim light, a faint powdery residue clung to the steel. Lomax frowned. "What is that?" Holmes rubbed the substance between his fingers before inhaling lightly. "Graphite powder," he announced, "a lubricant commonly used in lock mechanisms." I stared at him. "You mean—" Holmes smiled. "Yes, my dear Watson. This door was recently tampered with." Lomax's face drained of colour. But that's impossible. Only I have the key. Holmes pocketed the knife and straightened his posture. "Then you may wish to reconsider who else has had access to it." With that, he produced his own set of tools, and within seconds the lock clicked open. The heavy door groaned as it swung inward. We stepped into the archive room, the air noticeably colder. The desk we had examined earlier remained as it was, the scattered catalogue pages untouched. Holmes moved swiftly, his gaze darting between the locked cabinets. Then, abruptly, he halted. "What is it?" I asked. Instead of answering, he gestured toward one of the glass cases. We stepped closer, and I saw what had caught his attention. The case contained a collection of ancient manuscripts, their delicate pages sealed behind protective glass. But what Holmes had noticed was something far more subtle. A thin, nearly imperceptible smudge upon the glass. Someone had touched it. Holmes bent down, examining the edges of the case. His eyes gleamed. "Watson, observe closely. What do you see?" I leaned in. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then, as I studied the wooden base of the cabinet, I noticed a small, almost invisible scratch along the latch mechanism. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Very good." He then turned to Lomax. "Has anything been reported missing from this archive?" Lomax shook his head. "Not to my knowledge, but I can check the records." Holmes tapped a thoughtful finger against the glass case. "Do so, and if nothing appears missing, check again." Lomax hesitated, but then nodded and hurried off to retrieve the necessary documents. Once he was gone, I turned to Holmes. "You suspect theft?" Holmes smiled. "A deception, Watson. A clever one. Our so-called ghost is not here to haunt this library, but to take something from it." I frowned. But why go to such lengths? Why masquerade as an apparition? Holmes exhaled softly. "Ah, Watson, when one wishes to move unseen, what better disguise than one which ensures no one dares to look too closely?" A shiver ran through me. Holmes adjusted his coat. "Come, my friend, I believe it is time we turned the tables on our mysterious intruder." And with that, he strode from the room, already formulating the next move in his game of deduction. Rising stakes. The night deepened, and the great library settled into an uneasy stillness. The gas lamps flickered, casting elongated shadows against the towering bookshelves. Holmes stood near the entrance of the restricted archives, his keen gaze sweeping across the dimly lit room, as if expecting the very walls to whisper their secrets. Mr. Lomax returned, his face pale, a leather-bound ledger clutched in his trembling hands. "I have checked and rechecked the records, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice tight with unease. "Nothing appears missing. Every book and manuscript is accounted for." Holmes took the ledger from him, flipping through the entries with swift precision. After a moment, he let out a quiet hum. "And yet, Mr. Lomax, someone has gone to great trouble to gain access to these archives under the veil of spectral illusion." Lomax ran a hand over his balding head. "But if nothing is missing—" Holmes snapped the book shut. Then, perhaps the true objective was never to take something, but to leave something behind. The weight of his words hung in the air. Lomax's mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound emerged. I too felt a chill run through me at the implications. Before another word could be spoken, a sharp noise shattered the silence. a book tumbling from a shelf somewhere within the vast main hall. Holmes reacted instantly, striding toward the sound. Lomax and I followed, my heart hammering in my chest as we emerged into the reading hall. Our eyes were met with an unsettling sight. At the far end of the room, near one of the study alcoves, a book lay open on the floor. But more alarming was the figure standing in the shadows just beyond it, the Specter, the same ghostly figure we had glimpsed before, tall, draped in pale fabric, its face obscured. Holmes did not hesitate. With a sudden burst of movement, he sprang forward. The figure turned sharply and fled, disappearing between the towering bookshelves. "Watson, this way!" Holmes called. I followed as fast as my legs could carry me, weaving through the maze of shelves, my breath coming in short gasps. Ahead, the pale figure darted through the labyrinthine rows of books. Holmes moved with the agility of a predator, his every step calculated, his path unerring. The figure veered left, towards the library's service corridor. With a final push, Holmes lunged, his hand grasping at the fabric of the figure's cloak, only for his fingers to close around empty air. The figure had slipped through a narrow doorway and into the darkness beyond. Holmes pulled up short, staring at the passage. It was an old maintenance entrance, leading to a winding stairwell that descended to the lower levels of the building. Without hesitation he pressed forward, descending into the shadows. I hesitated. "Holmes, should we not call for the authorities?" Holmes did not turn back. "Patience, Watson. The moment of revelation is nearly upon us." Lomax, now visibly shaken, remained behind as Holmes and I ventured downward. The stairwell led to a narrow corridor, its walls damp with age. We moved, cautiously, our footsteps muffled by the stone floor. Then, suddenly, Holmes halted. He knelt, examining the ground. When I looked closer, I saw what had caught his attention. Footprints in the dust, leading toward an unmarked wooden door. Holmes reached for the handle. It was locked. Undeterred, he withdrew his lockpicks, and within moments there was a soft click. The door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment, and something else, something metallic. The room itself was small, its only furniture a heavy wooden table littered with scattered papers and an oil lamp that still flickered faintly. Holmes strode inside, his eyes darting across the room. "Fascinating!" I stepped forward, my gaze falling upon a sheet of parchment resting at the centre of the table. The ink was fresh. Someone had been here moments ago. Holmes picked up the paper, his expression unreadable as he scanned its contents. Then, with slow deliberation, he passed it to me. I read the words aloud. "The final key lies where knowledge sleeps, beneath the gaze of the forgotten scholar." A riddle. Holmes's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Ah, so that is their game." I looked at him. "Holmes, what does it mean?" He turned toward the door, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "It means, Watson, that we are closer than ever to our elusive adversary, and if my deductions are correct, they are about to make a most regrettable mistake." With that, he strode back toward the stairs, leaving me to follow in breathless anticipation. The game was truly afoot, Holmes's strategic play. Holmes ascended the stairwell with unwavering purpose, his mind clearly working through the puzzle at an astonishing pace. I followed closely, my thoughts still tangled in the cryptic message we had uncovered. The final key lies where knowledge sleeps, beneath the gaze of the forgotten scholar. It was a riddle, and if Holmes had already deciphered it, he was keeping the solution to himself. Mr. Lomax was waiting anxiously at the top of the stairs, wringing his hands. "Did you catch them? The intruder?" Holmes shook his head. They were too swift, though their escape was not without error. In their haste, they have left behind something of value. Lomax's eyes widened. A clue? Holmes merely smiled and strode past him toward the main reading hall. I matched his pace. "Holmes, you have an idea of what this all means, don't you?" He adjusted his coat absent-mindedly. "I have more than an idea, Watson. I have certainty." He reached the central hall and took a long, sweeping look at the vast rows of bookshelves, the grand reading tables, and the silent statues of long-forgotten scholars who watched over the hall. His gaze settled on one figure in particular, a marble bust mounted atop a pedestal near the far wall. I followed his line of sight. "That sculpture. It's of Sir Erasmus Finch," Lomax supplied from behind us, a former librarian, well respected in his time, though largely forgotten now. Holmes's lips curved ever so slightly. "The forgotten scholar," he murmured. My breath caught. Holmes, the riddle, beneath the gaze of the forgotten scholar. Could it mean precisely, Watson? Holmes was already moving toward the statue. Lomax and I hurried after him. The bust of Sir Erasmus Finch stood solemnly, its marble features worn with age. Holmes crouched before the pedestal, running his fingers along the base. Then, with a swift motion, he pressed against a barely perceptible seam in the wood panelling. Below, a faint click. The panel slid open. Lomax gasped audibly. Hidden within the recess was a small, leather-bound book. Holmes retrieved it with great care, brushing away the dust before opening the cover. His sharp eyes scanned the pages, and I saw a flicker of triumph in his expression. "What is it?" I asked. Holmes turned the book so that I could see. The pages were filled with strange coded writings, meticulously penned in ink that had only slightly faded with time. "A cipher," Holmes murmured, "a document of importance, though its meaning is not yet clear. This, gentlemen, is what our intruder has been seeking." Lomax looked bewildered. But why would they go to such lengths to obtain it? Why masquerade as a ghost? Holmes closed the book. "Because deception is often the surest way to hide intent. A common thief raises alarms. A supernatural entity, however, invites disbelief. Fear and superstition have a way of clouding reason, Mr. Lomax." He stood slipping the book into his coat pocket. "And now, gentlemen, it is time we laid a trap." I frowned. A trap? Holmes's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Yes, Watson, our elusive Specter will soon return for this volume, and when they do, we shall be waiting." He turned toward Lomax. "Mr. Lomax, I require your assistance. We must give our mysterious adversary exactly what they desire, while ensuring their capture in the process." Lomax swallowed hard. "Whew! What must I do?" Holmes smiled. "Simply follow my instructions to the letter." He strode off, already formulating his plan. The night was far from over, and the game was reaching its climax. The Specter had played their hand. Now it was Holmes's turn. The reveal. The air in the great library was thick with anticipation. The gas lamps flickered, casting restless shadows across the towering shelves, and the vast reading hall lay in eerie silence. The stage was set, and all that remained was for our elusive adversary to make their move. Holmes had been meticulous in his preparations. The ciphered book had been returned to its hiding place beneath the gaze of Sir Erasmus Finch. But not without a clever modification. Holmes had replaced the genuine volume with an indistinguishable replica, one whose pages contained nothing but meaningless scribbles. The true document rested safely in his coat pocket. I stood beside Holmes behind the long reference desk, concealed by the darkness. Lomax, nervous but obedient, played his role in the trap. He had dismissed the staff early, ensuring the library was deserted, and now he sat at his usual post near the entrance, feigning distraction with his paperwork. A single oil lamp burned beside him, its weak glow the only source of light in the cavernous hall. Time passed slowly. The library remained still, but then a sound, a soft shuffle of footsteps, barely perceptible, gliding across the stone floor. Holmes stiffened slightly, his sharp gaze snapping towards the far end of the hall. Then, as if materializing from the very air itself, the Spectre appeared. The figure was clad in the same flowing white garments as before, a spectral silhouette, moving with unnatural grace. It approached the statue of Erasmus Finch with eerie purpose, the ghostly disguise billowing with each silent step. Holmes's breath was steady, his body poised like a coiled spring. "Wait!" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure hesitated before the pedestal. A gloved hand reached forward, pressing against the hidden latch. A click. The panel slid open. The trap was sprung. Holmes surged forward with astonishing speed, his footfalls breaking the tense silence. "Stop where you are!" The Spectre whirled around, startled, but Holmes was upon them in an instant. With a swift motion, he seized the figure's wrist. The struggle was brief. A desperate twist, a flurry of movement, and with a sharp tug, Holmes wrenched away the flowing white shroud. The ghost was no spirit at all. A woman stood before us, her face pale with shock, her dark eyes flashing with something between fury and resignation. She was dressed in practical, form-fitting attire, clearly meant for stealth rather than haunting. Lomax let out a gasp. "Miss Davenport!" I stared in disbelief. The assistant librarian. Holmes's lips curled in satisfaction. Indeed, Miss Eleanor Davenport's chest rose and fell with rapid breaths. She glanced toward the exit, but Holmes tightened his grip on her wrist. "I would not advise it," he said coolly. Realizing escape was impossible, she straightened her posture, composing herself with remarkable swiftness. "Clever, Mr. Holmes," she admitted, her voice steady despite her predicament. "I underestimated you." Holmes released her and stepped back, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. "You are hardly the first to make that mistake, Miss Davenport. Now, shall we discuss the reason behind your rather theatrical crimes?" She exhaled slowly, as if weighing her options. Then, with a wry smile, she said, "I suppose I have little choice." I folded my arms. Why go to such lengths? Why the disguise, the deception? She glanced at Lomax, then at Holmes. Because, she said, there are some secrets that were never meant to be unearthed. Holmes tilted his head. And yet you sought them out regardless. Of course, jaw tightened. Not for myself. Holmes's eyes gleamed. No, for someone else. A tense silence settled between us. Then, with quiet certainty, Holmes said, "Tell me, Miss Davenport, who sent you?" Her expression flickered, betraying the truth even before she spoke. And in that moment I realized this mystery was far from over. Aftermath, Miss Eleanor Davenport stood in rigid silence, her sharp eyes darting between Holmes and the libraries, grand entrance, as though measuring the odds of escape. But there was no escape, not from Sherlock Holmes. Lomax, still reeling from the revelation, shook his head in disbelief. "Miss Davenport, I trusted you. You worked here for years. Why deceive us all?" She exhaled through her nose, folding her arms across her chest. "Because I had no choice." Holmes studied her with quiet intensity. "Ah, but there is always a choice, Miss Davenport. Yours was simply driven by necessity rather than desire. The true question remains, who compelled you?" For a fleeting second, something passed over her features, fear perhaps, or hesitation. Then she squared her shoulders. "I will say nothing." Holmes chuckled softly. "Oh, but you already have." He began pacing in slow, deliberate strides, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us review what we know. You have masqueraded as a spectre to terrify any prying eyes away from this particular library wing, using superstition as your ally. A cunning method, though ultimately flawed." He gestured toward the hidden compartment beneath the bust of Erasmus Finch. "Your goal was this ciphered book, buried beneath the gaze of a forgotten scholar. You sought it desperately, but not for yourself." Davenport's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Holmes turned sharply to Lomax. "Mr. Lomax, tell me, how long has Miss Davenport worked at this library?" Lomax blinked. 6 years. "And before that?" Lomax hesitated. I don't know." Holmes smiled. "Precisely." He pivoted back to Davenport, a woman with no apparent history before taking up employment here. That, I suspect, is by design. "Tell me, Miss Davenport, does the name Baron Alistair Redgrave mean anything to you?" A sharp intake of breath was all the confirmation Holmes required. Lomax looked confused. "Baron Redgrave? The nobleman? What does he have to do with this?" Holmes nodded. "A nobleman by title, a collector of secrets by trade. He is known among certain circles for acquiring rare and forbidden knowledge, often through less than reputable means." I frowned. "And you believe he is behind this?" Holmes inclined his head. "Consider the facts, Watson. The ciphered book hidden within this library is no ordinary manuscript. The secrecy surrounding it, the peculiar nature of its concealment, it all suggests that it contains something of great value." Miss Davenport was not working alone. She was sent by someone with both the knowledge of its existence and the resources to retrieve it discreetly. He looked back at Davenport. "And I dare say Baron Redgrave is the most likely candidate." Davenport's mask of indifference faltered. "You know nothing of him," she said quietly. Holmes's expression darkened. On the contrary, I'd know quite enough. A heavy silence settled between them. Then, at last, Davenport sighed. He will find another way, you realize. If you stop me, someone else will come. Holmes's lips curled in amusement. Let him try. Davenport hesitated for only a moment before offering a small wry smile. You're either very brave, Mr. Holmes, or very foolish. Holmes raised a brow. The two are not mutually exclusive. Before she could reply, the distant sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hall. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade burst through the entrance, flanked by two constables. His sharp eyes scanned the room, falling upon Holmes, myself, Lomax, and finally Miss Davenport. "Well, well," Lestrade muttered. "Looks like you've already done the hard work, Holmes." Holmes gave a slight nod. "A habit of mine." Lestrade gestured toward the constables. "Take her in. We'll see what she has to say down at the yard." The officers stepped forward, but Davenport did not resist. As they led her away, she cast one last look over her shoulder at Holmes. "You should leave this alone, Mr. Holmes," she said. "There are things even you don't understand." Holmes merely smiled. That, Miss Davenport, is what makes life interesting. With that, she was gone. Lomax let out a shaky breath. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes dusted off his coat. "No need for gratitude, Mr. Lomax. The case was its own reward." He turned to me. "Come, Watson, I believe supper is long overdue." I chuckled, "And here I thought you found nourishment in the pursuit of mystery alone." Holmes smirked. "Even I am not above the delights of a well-cooked meal." And with that, we stepped out into the fog-draped streets of London, leaving behind the echoes of a spectre that had never truly existed. Outro? The rain had begun to fall lightly, as Holmes and I stepped into the bustling streets of London, the gas lamps casting hazy golden halos through the evening mist. Our cab rattled through the thoroughfares, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against cobblestone filling the silence between us. Holmes, as always, sat deep in thought, fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. At last, I broke the quiet. "You have that look about you, Holmes. Your mind is still turning over the case." Holmes exhaled a soft chuckle. "Indeed, Watson, a mind such as mine does not so easily disengage from intrigue." He leaned back slightly, tapping a thoughtful finger against his temple. "Miss Davenport's warning lingers with me. There are things even you don't understand." He repeated her words, savouring them as one might a peculiar flavour. I nodded. She was undoubtedly referring to Baron Redgrave. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Perhaps. But I wonder, Watson, if she meant something more. The carriage turned a corner, the glow of Baker Street drawing nearer. I studied my friend's face in the dim light. "You believe there is more to this than a nobleman's ambition for rare manuscripts?" A small, knowing smile played upon Holmes's lips. "There is always more." We arrived at 201B Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson, ever the vigilant caretaker, greeted us with a warm meal and her usual exasperation at Holmes's disregard for conventional dining hours. As we settled into our sitting room, I poured us each a brandy, eager to reflect upon the case in the comfort of familiar surroundings. Holmes took his glass, but did not immediately drink. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his sharp eyes. A ciphered manuscript hidden beneath the watchful gaze of Erasmus Finch. He mused aloud, a woman who risked everything to retrieve it, and a man, Baron Redgrave, who for now remains but a shadow on the periphery. I sipped my brandy. Do you expect to cross paths with him? Holmes turned to me with a glimmer of amusement. I do not expect, Watson. I know. I let out a soft chuckle. Then I dare say we shall find ourselves entangled in yet another perilous adventure before long. Holmes swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Such is the nature of the game. The grandfather clock chimed the hour. Outside, the rain continued its quiet patter against the window pane. And so, with another mystery unravelled, and yet another lingering in the shadows, I sat beside my old friend in the warmth of our shared study, already anticipating the next case that fate would deliver to the doorstep of 221B Baker Street.